Our panel this afternoon is, our first panel this afternoon is entitled Shocking Elections. You'll recall from my presentation this morning that the innovation methodologically of our project is that rather than just eyeballing countries and events and trying to infer lessons, that we are looking at explicit independent variables, that is causal events, to see what happens and how much do political institutions shape what the outcome is. And when people think of shocks, and especially in a climate project or program, those shocks may be climate related, as we talked about. They may be floods, they may be droughts. Other shocks that people think of are spillover of migrants from wars in neighboring countries and so forth. But when we were putting this project together at our initial meeting in, I think it was May, June of 2010, folks said, well, what about elections? And elections can meet our definition of a shock. That is a sudden change in the distribution of power and resources. For example, when a regime that's been in place for a long time all of a sudden suffers an election defeat. And the question is, what happens? Do we have a soft landing and a peaceful outcome, or do we have a hard landing, including violence? And so the cases we're going to look at don't all involve exclusively elections as the shock, but each one of them involves at least one election shock, and that's why we have grouped them together. Our first presenter is Gilbert Kadiagala. Gilbert is the Jan Smuts Professor of International Relations and the head of the Department of International Relations at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa, in Johannesburg, the most prestigious university in South Africa. He's previously taught at several other institutions, including Johns Hopkins University, where I first met him. He's the author and editor of several books. I'll mention two. One I'll mention because he's the author of Meddlers or Mediators, African Interveners in Civil Conflicts in Eastern Africa in 2007. And the other book I'll mention because I'm in it. He's the co-editor of Conflict Management and African Politics, Ripeness, Bargaining, and Mediation, which is actually a tribute to one of our other authors, Bill Zartman. It's a Festschrift of sorts. Gilbert Kadiagala is currently doing research on leadership in post-conflict reconstruction in Africa, and today he will be talking about Kenya. So Gilbert, please.
Alan, thank you very much, and thank you very much for coming back. It's always a challenge to keep people awake at this time of the day, but we're trying. The panel has assured me that we're actually going to make an exciting presentation here, so that we can all be up and running. What I want to do is simply to summarize some of the key issues that I raise in my paper, which is still very much a work in progress. But I thought the best way to summarize it, really the best way to present it is to summarize the argument, and then I'll look at the four shocks and the outcomes, because I think that part of the story is not as important. The shocks are very clear, they're very straightforward, but I think for the purpose of the presentation, I thought what I'll do is to just raise a few big conceptual issues that come out of the Kenyan story. And I think the first one is that the project has been assuming that constitutional design, in fact, should manage shocks and conflicts. The Kenyan story, however, tells us that, in fact, constitutional design has been an arena of contestation. And I think that's an important element. So that as we look at the four shocks, we are going to ask the question, therefore, when and how did this constitutional design become an area of contestation? The other point I want to put to the table is that the Kenyan story reveals that what you've been seeing over the last 20 years is essentially accumulation of shocks that lead to incremental changes in the constitutional design. So it's a back and forth kind of process. There are shocks around the bigger issue about the contestation of the constitutional design. But some of these shocks over time, over the 20-year period, have been gradually building smaller shocks and smaller outcomes that are still very much a work in progress. The other point that I make in the paper is that shocks, in fact, in the Kenyan context, have epitomized the weaknesses in the constitutional design at two levels. I think the first level is the single-party regime that was in place until 1991 that was overthrown through, as I will argue, through the first shock, popular pressure and mass mobilization. So the very fact that you had a single-party constitutional dispensation, that became essentially a center of contestation, or rather, at least that shock was a reflection of the very fact that you have a very weak institutional structure. But the second story about the link between, or rather shocks epitomizing weaknesses in a constitutional design is throughout the 90s, after the inauguration of a semi-competitive political system. That semi-competitive political system, in fact, became the center of other shocks. And that's why the theory about the constitutional design itself is unleashes shocks. The other point I'm making in the paper is that shocks have generated countervailing shocks. And these have come in two forms. You have had violent responses to initial shocks, and this comes out very clearly in the early 90s after the inauguration of the multi-party dispensation. You have a shock that comes up, a reactive shock to the initial outcome of that dispensation. So you have violent militarization of state and society as an outcome of a shock that was unleashed by the very fact that people were contesting the constitutional order. But also the other countervailing shocks that have been produced by these outcomes, the incremental outcomes in constitutional design, have led to ethnic mobilization. And this has led to violence, and I think it's a bigger picture that we paint in the paper that has been popular, or rather gradual mobilization of ethnicity as one of the responses to the shocks. But there is also a period in 2003, 2005, when the countervailing response to the initial shock was essentially ethnic aggregation around a coalition that didn't actually last very long, and that's part of the discussion. That shocks lead to, one of the countervailing responses to initial shocks is ethnic alliance building. So the combination of the first 2 points, which is shocks as emblems of weak constitutional design, and then the mobilization of grievances around shocks, leads us to, again, a point that says shocks are sources of constitutional change. Or in the Kenyan case, shocks have led to incremental change. The big question I want to put to the table is there is a very dangerous dynamic in the Kenyan case where you have had a cyclical pattern of shocks and outcomes, leading to the question, therefore, Kenya now has a new constitution, 2010 constitution. Is it the end of this cycle of shocks and outcomes that nobody really knows what they look like? And I think this is an important point to put to the table, because I'm going to end on the point that there is a new constitution, but we don't really know the quality of this constitution. We cannot judge the sturdiness of this constitution in terms of dealing with future shocks. And I think this is a point that Alan is going to like, given our discussion that we had this morning. The new constitution is going to be judged against what we are calling in the morning the very bigger shocks, like climate change. And therefore, my argument here is that there is a new constitutional framework that arose from these cyclical shocks and outcomes. But now we've arrived at a point where there is, in fact, a constitutional framework that we now have to begin to judge whether it's steady enough to deal with bigger issues of demographic change, bigger issues of environmental challenges, and bigger issues of land redistribution and urbanization and so on. So in a way, the new constitution is essentially a work in progress. And if one were to start the research today, I think it would be much more useful to say, to how do we judge this constitution in light of its resilience when it comes to problems of future shocks, which are very much alive at this point. So what are the major shocks that I identify in the study? The first one is early 1990s, when there is the coalescence of internal pressures for democratization against the government of Mr. Daniel Arap Moi, who had been in power for quite a long time. So essentially the contestation around the one-party state. And it was an interesting period because there is a coalescence of internal pressures and donor pressures from without. And they coalesce around the issue about how do you reintroduce multi-party systems in Kenya. And therefore, 1991 is a good moment for that success, that incremental success. The time when Kenya says we have arrived, we have restored multi-party democracy. But this grand outcome of 1991, in fact, is a false promise because it unleashes precisely the kind of countervailing pressures, countervailing shocks, most of them produced by the state around the new order. So you have the inauguration of a very semi-competitive political dispensation. You have violent militarization of society, violent militarization of the state by the Moi government, designed essentially to undo the very constitutional framework that is put in place. So that's the, when we read about the violence in the Rift Valley in the 1990s, before the elections, I think that's a very good instance of an outcome that promises actually to, a constitutional design that says we're going to use it to resolve all these other issues. But essentially the constitutional design of 1990 becomes another source of shock that society has to confront. And the second shock, therefore, that I deal with in the paper is the civil society protests and pressures in the mid-1990s. And what are they trying to say? They're trying to shock the system to say, you're not open enough. Competitive democratization has come up, but at the real expense of institution building. And that's why that era, the false promise of institutional change that we see in the 90s is very important. Thirdly, I talk about three minor shocks that are produced by the second shock of constitutional contestation in the mid-90s. And these are the shocks that come about as a result, one, of the demise of the KANU government. Moi is out in 2002, and I argue the exit of Moi, but particularly the loss of power by KANU, is a minor shock. It doesn't constitute a bigger shock because everybody expected that he was going to leave. And therefore, it's more of a personalized shock to Moi rather than a shock to the system. The second minor shock, I argue, is the unraveling of this promise of ethnic aggregation that had come about as a result of the demise of KANU. So NAC comes up to power in 2002. Very quickly, it unravels. And therefore, this is actually confusing the process of constitutional design because everybody was like celebrating that, I mean, at least the barbarian was out, and now we can get back to the process of constitution making, but that doesn't happen. But more important, in the 2003-2005, I argue that there is a bigger shock, which is Mr. Kibaki's loss of the constitutional referendum. So what we are holding constant is everybody's been trying to get to a new constitution. We haven't gotten there yet, and the new government essentially loses a referendum, very decisive referendum that prepares the road for more ethnic polarization, for more shocks, and therefore for the bigger shock, which is the electoral violence of 2007, unleashing a civil war. And a civil war, I argue here, is actually the most of the profound shocks in actually producing a new dispensation. So what happened, just to summarize that, the electoral shock of 2007 is that the civil war, Kenya is saved from the civil war by the international community. Comes in and says, you need to work together, but you also need to be responsible. So that's a bigger shock that leads to what I call in the paper elite coalescence around a new constitution that was finally unveiled in 2010. It is a constitution that promises to address some of the grievances that have been underlying the Kenyan story. That means you still have problems of land reform, you still have issues of power, decentralization, and so on. So that's why I put it from the outset, that the best way really to judge this constitution is to say, how prepared is it in confronting future shocks which have been seeming in the background? I think I'll stop here.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, David. Our second presenter on this panel is Justin Frosini. Justin holds a PhD in constitutional law from Bologna University in Italy. It says Bologna University. I think they mean University of Bologna in Italy. Ho sbagliato. Mi dispiace.
Prego.
In Italy, he is assistant professor at the Bocconi University in Milan, and actually was just mentioning me that the official who's been now named to head, at least on a transition basis, the new government in Italy is the president of your university?
That's right.
President of your university. So out with Berlusconi, in with Bocconi. Okay. In Bologna, Professor Frosini is director of the Center for Constitutional Studies and Democratic Development. Obviously extraordinarily well qualified for this project. He's also an affiliated scholar at the Bologna Center of Johns Hopkins University, and he's on the editorial board of several comparative law journals. And today he'll be talking to us about Ghana. Justin.
Thank you, Alan. I don't know whether the PowerPoint
Can
will
we,
appear. Okay. In the meantime, I'll take 30 seconds, as Alan was saying, and I think Zachary at the beginning. Okay, great. This research could be applied equally to Western European countries, and Alan was just mentioning that we have just had a very big shock in Italy because, to use the words of Gilbert, our barbarian has just gone, Berlusconi, and as Alan was saying, we've had a shock as the Bocconi University because our president has just been appointed as the new prime minister, which means that when I go back to Italy, I will be able to say, mi presidente es tu presidente. So that will be quite interesting to mention this to my colleagues. But I'm not going to be talking about shocks and constitutional design in Italy, but rather constitutional design and conflict management in Ghana. Another 30 seconds to explain why this case study. Alan underlined the fact that I'm a comparative constitutionalist. I'm not an Africanist. I'm not specialized in a single country. And when we had the meeting in Washington, we decided together that it would be a good idea to have an example of what could be termed as the dog that doesn't bite, or the dog that didn't bite. In other words, a country where the democratic process would appear to be working quite well. Now, that title remained in the workshop in Antwerp. However, as you can see, I have changed it slightly, and the title is now The Dog That Doesn't Bite, But Sometimes Barks. Now, what are we fundamentally talking about here? The whole issue of Ghana and maybe what we could consider a form of Ghanaian exceptionalism within the African context. In other words, we have often heard Ghana being referred to as the shining star or as the beacon of democracy, to use the words of Lindsay Whitfield. as to its democratic process. As you can see from the paper, obviously for reasons of brevity, I'm not going to go through the 6 shocks that I have dealt with in detail, but you will see that there is a historical overview which fundamentally takes into consideration a 6-decade political trajectory, which goes from colonial rule, parliamentary monarchy, to the presidential republic. Among other things, as we will see in a second, the first shock that I've taken into consideration, the construction of the Volta Dam, which in terms of its duration is a shock that goes over a long time period, to refer to the brief, the research brief of, that Alan published a few months ago. That goes over the 3 periods, okay? And this, as you will see in the paper, there is a historical background and a literature review concerning this. Now, I have basically pinpointed 6 shocks. I'm going to be principally talking about the last 3 because of the title also of this panel, but let us not forget the first 3, which are extremely important, i.e. the Volta Dam construction and all the related resettlement that was connected to the construction of that dam. An interesting case, which is the Apollo 586 and the Salah case, which goes back to the Busia presidency. The return of over 1 million Ghanaians expelled from Nigeria in 1983. There was also a further expulsion in 1985. And then, very importantly, under the present constitution, which I think obviously for this project is of particular interest, the parliamentary and presidential elections of 1992, 2000, and 2008. Now, very quickly, as far as the shocks are concerned, the Volta Dam, just to remind you, we're talking about the largest man-made lake in the world. We're talking about a project that began before Ghana, which was the first country in Africa, let me remind you, to obtain independence. It was then the Gold Coast. This project began in 1953 when the Gold Coast was still under British rule. But the person that was behind this, as you can see from the satellites, the magnitude of this lake, and therefore, from an environmental point of view, the significance that this, the construction of this dam had. It was a man and an idea in many respects. We're talking about Kwame Nkrumah, also known as Osakiefo, the Redeemer. Very much there was a connection between this project and this person who obviously became the first leader of independent Ghana. Now, here there are a series of issues where this shock comes out of the dam construction, the resettlement process, the shocks that this brought about. Here, again, for reasons of brevity, I will say this, that this shock does not lead to widespread violent conflict or anything of this sort, but it does cause a series of problems in terms of the resettlement when the dam is finally completed in the mid-60s, because we find a whole series of cases. Let me just take one of Tema, where we have a shanty town that has been constructed around Tema, which is in part the result of that long process of resettlement. So a difficulty of the various regimes that we had during that period to deal with that resettlement process. You will find more specific details in the paper about the different committees that were set up and so on and so forth to deal with the construction of the dam. The second shock that I deal with is what is known as the Apollo 586 case and the resulting Salah case. What is all this about? It is about the Busia presidency after the coup d'etat of 1966, and the fact that he wanted to, in some way, downsize public administration. One of the things that he did was to sack 586 civil servants, and this, in my mind, was undoubtedly a shock. And one of the results of this was that one of the people that had been sacked, Salah, decided to go to the Supreme Court. Now, this obviously is very interesting within the context of our project because we have a shock. We see the use of the constitutional mechanisms that are in place to try and resolve this. we have a decision that is taken by the Supreme Court, which is in favor of Salah, and then Bouzia refuses to accept this decision. And this in itself we could consider, as I underline in the paper, another shock which I don't specifically deal with, okay? But I think this is very interesting to see how the constitutional design of the time deals with this. Then we have the issue of the expulsion of over 1 million Ghanaians in 1983. Now here, again, we could go into quite a bit of detail as to the reasons why this expulsion took place. Some talk about a retaliation against Ghana because of a citizenship law that had been introduced a few years earlier that had certainly penalized Nigerians and others. This was related a lot to trading, to the property of enterprise and so on and so forth. But in the Ghanaian context, what is important is that at a certain point we see the return of over 1 million Ghanaians. It's very difficult to actually get the precise figures, obviously. And this, again, results in problems of resettlement, problems of Ghanaians that decide not even to remain in Ghana but to go abroad. And most of all, this has an effect on the Rawlings regime, the authoritarian regime that was the result of the coup d'etat of 1982. And in particular, it will have an adverse effect on a situation that already economically is very difficult. And among other things, I know that one of our discussants, Gordon Crawford, has already addressed in some way this issue of the economic implications in the 1980s of the problems that the Rawlings regime had, the fact that he had to go to the International Monetary Fund and so on and so forth. This actually is interesting from an economic standpoint because in a certain sense we see a move from here, from this shock, to an economic development in Ghana that we will see in the future years. So from an economic standpoint, this I think is an interesting shock. Obviously, there is a whole issue related to the history of rivalry between Ghana and Nigeria. This is an interesting photograph because, as you can see, the Ghanaians that had to leave Nigeria quite quickly were using these bags. These bags are actually called Ghana Must Go bags. Okay, so this is very symbolic of what happened in 1983 and in part in 1985. Then we have the 1992 Constitution. Now this is the part I think that is most interesting in the time that I have left. How? 5 minutes, okay. The 1992 Constitution is the result of a negotiation between the Rawlings regime, therefore an authoritarian regime, and the opposition. And therefore we have a constitution that in this sense is a compromise between the authoritarian regime of the time and the democratic forces. What we can underline here is that we have the elections of 1992. The presidential and parliamentary elections are separated from one another. These elections are contested. Rawlings is elected as president. The parliamentary elections that take place after that are boycotted by the opposition. However, in a certain sense, we can say that this is the beginning of the democratic transition for Ghana. I'm going to go quickly through this part. Then we have the 2000 presidential and parliamentary elections. Here you can see a very interesting photograph. Can I have some water, please? Sorry.
Yeah. Is this one yours? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Being obliged to rush through this and talking so, I beg your pardon. Okay, this is the presidential and parliamentary elections of 2000. Now this is very significant because here we have the first changeover. Rawlings, because of the limit, the terms limit, cannot be again candidate as president. So we have the first alternation in power. Kufuor becomes the president of Ghana. A shock, undoubtedly a shock. The result, violent conflict, widespread violent conflict? No. We have a changeover, and in this sense, this is very significant, obviously, in terms of democratic transitions. As you can see, the two the peaceful change of hands between arch rivals. Finally, the 2008 presidential and parliamentary elections. Again, I'm going through this very quickly. For the details, you can see the paper. These elections are very closely contested elections, fundamentally too close to call. Philippe and others have talked about the element of luck. I think the fact that the results did not bring about a situation of shared government, in other words, a majority of one party in parliament and the election of a president of the other party, probably was an important factor, because I'm not quite sure, it's an issue of sliding doors here, what would have happened if we would have had a situation of shared government, okay? The other issue is, of course, the discovery in the meantime of oil in Ghana, okay? I have 2 minutes, so, and this is something that maybe during the Q&A session we can discuss. Now, very quickly, constitutional factors that have fundamentally promoted Ghana's peace, because this is something that we can certainly underline. First of all, the issue of term limits, because if Rawlings had been able to continue as president, then maybe that democratic transition would have not been exactly the same. If, for example, Atta Mills had had to fight against his rival Kufuor again, then maybe the result of the elections would have been different. On the whole, in terms of ethno-regional representation, there is not that ethnic conflict that we find in other countries. Certainly the Akans are the prevailing ethnic community, but there isn't that contrast that we have in other areas, okay? There are issues as far as northern Ghana is concerned, but there isn't that ethnic conflict that we find in elsewhere in Africa. Fairly free media and pluralism of the media, fairly independent courts, although they are underfunded, and an independent electoral commission. This is quite interesting because, as many of you know, the electoral commission in Ghana is considered a model not just for West Africa, but also beyond. Some of the non-constitutional factors promoting Ghana's peace. Well, the first one is strong two-party system and the possibility of a life outside politics. I do underline that maybe the issue of the two-party system is only partially a non-constitutional factor, because certainly the majority electoral system in some way contributes to the fact that there is this two-party system, so we could discuss this. Non-existence, as I was saying before, of an ethnic majority. The role of the chiefs in conflict resolution, this is something else that we could certainly talk about. Improvements that have been made to constitutional design and conflict managements when there have been situations of shock. For example, the National Disaster Committee, for example, which is something that's been introduced to try and deal with certain disasters. The issue of flight over fight tendency. Many Ghanaians prefer the idea of going abroad rather than staying in the country, and where there are situations of conflict, fighting, okay? This is something, again, that we could discuss. One may agree or less on this point, but there would seem to be this issue of leaving the country rather than getting into a situation of conflict. An issue of military regime exhaustion. In other words, the idea that the military has done its time and we need civil governments. I'm 0 time, so the other issue, which I think is extremely interesting, is the idea that the Ghanaians themselves are beginning to convince themselves of the idea of exceptionalism, and therefore they want to safeguard this peaceful reputation. They're proud of it, and therefore I think that is another factor. I will just go to the final slide. Bear in mind that we have had the work over the last 2 years of a constitutional review commission, which hopefully we'll have the chance to talk about during the Q&A session. There are discussions as to ways to reform the 1992 Constitution, which, let us not forget, is the result of that compromise with the authoritarian Rawlings government of 1992, therefore a very strong presidential system. These are 4 elements that I've taken into consideration that ought to be part of a possible reform of the Constitution. The last slide is just a picture of Independence Square in 2007 when they celebrated the 50th anniversary of the independence. Thank you.
Justin, I want you to know I let you go over by 2 minutes, but I did so only in hopes that you would put in a good word with about me with the Prime Minister of Italy.
I will do.
Our next presenter is Andrew Reynolds. Andrew Reynolds is Associate Professor of Political Science, and he's also the Chair of Global Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I think it's fair to say that the project that we're working on today, Andrew was on the case a long time ago, and we're very much building on his work. And in fact, it's arguably true that this project wouldn't have happened had it not been for some of Andrew's earlier work. And I mean that specifically so that when I've been teaching conflict management now since 2002, and around that time, Andrew published a book, and it had a debate in it, amongst other things, between two of the titans of constitutional design for conflict management, Arend Leipart and Don Horowitz. And I assigned this debate each year, and we would fight it out in the seminar each year. And I wanted to know who was right. And so when someone came to me, the former director of the Strauss Center a few years ago, and said, let's write up a grant proposal for a research program. Do you have any questions that you'd want to answer? I said, yeah, I want to answer the question that was in Andrew's book. So in many ways, you are the intellectual foundation, if you don't mind my putting that on you, for this whole project. In any case, that book was called Designing Democracy in a that book was called Architecture of Democracy, Constitutional Design, Conflict Management, and Democracy. It was put out by Oxford in 2002. More recently, his latest work is a book called Designing Democracy in a Dangerous World, and that's published now, no? Also by Oxford University Press. So without any further ado, I give you Andrew Reynolds, who will be talking about Zimbabwe.
Yes, I do, mind you, overselling my contribution dramatically. The key is to lower expectations for any public presentation, and you've just ruined that. But it's actually a great honor to be here, and as part of this group and part of this conference, but also part of this panel, which are scholars that I greatly respect and admire, and so it's a thrill to be here in Texas and to be part of today's proceedings. As Alan said, I have been briefed with talking about Zimbabwe. And of course, for those of you who have any tangential knowledge of Zimbabwe, you'll know that this is, like most of our cases, exceptionally complicated and exceptionally troubling in many respects. It's also troubling on a theoretical, I think, academic level, in the sense that it does demonstrate a lot of these inherent contradictions of the endogeneity of constitutions, of institutions, of shocks to the system, of the consequences of government behavior, but the cyclical nature, as Gilbert was talking about in the Kenyan case, of political institutions, their manipulation, and the effects of those manipulations. And Kathy and Bill spoke to these issues earlier about the difficulty of teasing out causal directions, and I think Zimbabwe demonstrates that in great effect. I also wanted to step back and just take a very brief amount of time to sort of say, why are we interested in this? Why are we interested in these sort of rather abstract issues of constitutions and of de jure documents and of political institutions? And I probably am speaking for most of us, but I'm interested in it because I believe they matter to the individual, and that people's lives and the person and the mother and the father and the child and the village are affected by the consequences of these issues. And really, to me, there's no point spending all this money and having all these fabulous brains working on the problem if we don't understand that it's affecting individuals in Africa and throughout the world dramatically. So the way the Constitution is designed, and I'm sure Zach and others would testify to this as well, is core because it affects political behavior, which in turn affects the running of the state, which in turn affects the way people live their everyday lives, from the rule of law to the access to food, to water, to healthcare, and the avoidance of conflict and war. And, you know, in some senses, I'm very honored to be part of a group with Bill Zartman, because Bill Zartman's work about abstract mediation and about abstract conflict resolution has for decades been about the individual. It's about how you improve the lives of the person, and he does that through his work on conflict resolution and mediation. So I think it's important for us to remember that this should be how it affects individuals. And if we can't make that tie, then I think the project is lost. But I think one of the successes so far of this project is that it does make the tie to good governance and that effect on the individual. So that cheerleading, that prophesizing to the choir, leads me to the Zimbabwean case. And I do think Zimbabwe is a classic case, as I said, of constitutional design, both mediating and promoting the state's responses to crises. And sometimes constitutional design is facilitating the state's promotion and accentuating those crises as well. Zimbabwe is also interesting, I think, to those who study ethnic conflict, because the ethnic segments, the identifiable communal elements of Zimbabwe, have moved in shifting alliances. And I think they've moved in shifting alliances partly because of the use and misuse of political institutions over time. And I'll say a little bit more about that. And the title, if you've seen the title of my paper, is somewhat provocative and overselling on the basis of marketing purposes. But it's talking about how Mugabe has made a non-racial alliance in opposition to his behavior. And I want to make this case that in embryo, it may not last, and it may atrophy over time, and other pressures may be formed upon it, but you have an interlinguistic, ethnic, and an interracial alliance of people in Zimbabwe now that have somewhat dropped their identities as hyphen Zimbabweans, and to some extent reflect Robert Sobukwe's desire for a Pan-African, non-racial African identity of African nationalism. And Mugabe, through his behavior, has managed to do that in Zimbabwe. So you'll see in my paper, if you ever get a chance to look at it or when it comes out in publication,
Or if you want to get it on the shelf out there.
or if you want to get it on the shelf out there, but not now because I'm speaking. That it has three shocks and three moments of time which we try and use as a lens for understanding the Zimbabwean political dispensation. The first moment in time is the Gukurahundi massacres, the massacres of Undibeli in Matabeleland in the 1980s. The second is the third Shumarenga, the third War of Liberation, which was the land invasions, the land occupations, and the conflict around that, pretty much from about 2000 on. And the third shock is the electoral moment of 2008, the point where violence was unleashed and the state effectively went into even further freefall than it had been before. And again, constitutional design, I think, has promoted and reacted and mediated the state's behavior under all of these events. Constitutionally, Zimbabwe is also interesting to somebody who studies political institutions because it has moved over time, and we have different time periods to assess how the institutions have worked. And if you think about Eli's construct of majoritarian versus consensual or power-sharing institutions, integrative versus power-sharing institutions, before 1980, this was a supra-majoritarian state. It was majoritarian within the white Southern Rhodesian community itself, but of course, because it was a settler white minority state, it was even more majoritarian because even within that community, they were then dominating the entire nation state with a very small minority of the population. Between 1980 and 1985, the Lancaster House Agreement put in place a degree of inclusion or moving somewhat to the power-sharing side of the scale. So you had proportional representation elections. You had very limited federalism. You had reserved seats for whites and Asians, 20 of those. And you had the broaching of land reform, which, of course, like many African countries, is key to politics and society, the issue of land in Zimbabwe. But then from 1985 onwards, the constitutional construct writ large changed again. So in 1985, you moved back to Anglo-American first-past-the-post majoritarian elections. The minority seats were abolished. Federalism was largely removed. It became presidential. Robert Mugabe moved himself from being a prime minister to being a president, and the Senate was abolished as that second check on power. It became more and more of a one-party state, both de jure and de facto, in that period between 85 and about 2008. And then since 2008, we have what is crafted on paper as a power-sharing government, very similar in some ways to Kenya. But I think for the many of us who've been attracted to power-sharing constructs in the past, we see the Zimbabwe power-sharing government as one of the least successful and least attractive power-sharing constructs that has ever really existed. So let me very briefly go over and just mention some of these shocks and how I think the Constitution mediated them. The shock of the Matabele massacres in the 1980s were prompted, well, in fact, the shock itself was a point of tension between Shona and Ndebele that had reached a flashpoint stage that could be exploited by both sides. Clearly, Shona and Ndebele in Zimbabwe have long had their historical divisions and segments. In fact, even the name Zimbabwe was contested, in that Zimbabwe was the Shona name, a Shona civilization, and the Ndebele, many of them argued for Matopos, for a non-ethnically chauvinistic name for the new nation states. In some senses, it reminds me of Darfur. Initial skirmishing, initial reactions from the indigenous regional community brought back upon itself a huge reign of terror against it, a massive overreaction in a sense, overwhelming force, which then bred a situation of devastating human life and conflict. So, as we know, and as you'll know when you read some of the documentary evidence, this is a somewhat understudied and unknown experience, but the legacy continues today. Some people say that Mugabe's clinging onto power is partly because he does not want to be charged with abuses that primarily happened in Matabele land between 1982 and 1987. 20,000 people were killed in that time period. There was a far larger number of people tortured and attacked and driven from their homes, and the community, the Ndebele minority, was marginalized. And it was constitutionally mediated by the fact that the state was power sharing in certain respects, but it was power sharing between the former white Rhodesians and the black majority Shona. The Ndebele, and I can go into this in more detail in other forums, but the Ndebele were largely left out of that power sharing deal. And it was a deal that kept the white economic interests and the black majority interests, both informally and formally, within the state, but left out that significant minority that felt marginalized from the state as a whole. The second shock, the third Chimurenga, the land invasions of 2000 onwards, were actually sparked by ZANU, the government of Zimbabwe, losing an election, losing a constitutional referendum in 2000 on their new constitutional provisions, which would have, A, allowed them to repossess land without compensation, which nobody really cared about, but secondly, gave massive new executive powers to Mugabe, which a lot of people cared about, and so Mugabe lost that referendum. And in the aftermath of that, literally within 2 weeks, he unleashed these paramilitary war veterans, other groups, to extrajudicially, outside of the rule of law, repossess land. It was a classic campaign strategy of populism, of getting people back on his side as the economy was atrophying and getting worse and worse. And then, of course, we know the consequences of that was economic, agricultural, inflationary freefall of the economy, to the point where Zimbabwe, up until a couple of years ago, was devastated economically, from being the breadbasket of Africa to being totally destroyed and unable to feed its own population. And again, I think the third Chimurenga was allowed for and was facilitated by the fact that the state had moved the institutions to being more centralized, more majoritarian, and fewer checks upon the utilization of central power from Harare. It's hard to imagine that the rule of law could have been so suspended if there had been more democratic checks, as there were even in 1980 in the system at the time. So the last shock is the aftermath of the 2008 elections. as many of you will remember, in 2008, the shock was Mugabe was going to lose the elections. In fact, many people would say Mugabe did lose those elections. The first round of the presidential election came just after he had lost his majority in the parliamentary elections. The first round, which was heavily manipulated, probably a lot of ballot stuffing, probably a lot of vote rigging, certainly intimidation of anti-ZANU supporters during the election, still led to Morgan Tsvangirai, the opposition candidate, winning 47% of the vote to Mugabe's 48% to Mugabe's 43%. But because of the fabulous two-round system, the election was not done. They had to go to a second round. Mugabe was expected to step down. There were many newspaper reports that the deal had been done, that Mugabe was going to leave office. But at the last minute, he decided to stand and fight, and literally stand and fight, and unleash again the state upon the opposition. And so again, we have a few hundred people killed, but the numbers of deaths are not indicative of the real issue of post-2008, because the state deliberately wanted to torture people and attack them, but not kill them, so they could be sent home to be visible emblems of what would happen to you if you voted the wrong way. So we saw thousands of people tortured, thousands of detainees, and many thousands driven off their land again. And again, it was reflected in increasing majoritarianism of Mugabe's rule, taking away the powers of the Senate, of governors, centralizing power within his Politburo, and not allowing any forms of checks constitutionally. So just to close, then you have the 2008 power-sharing deal. You have now, brokered by African states, especially South Africa, a government that has Morgan Tsvangirai as the opposition prime minister, Robert Mugabe as the sitting president, a sharing of cabinet positions between, in fact, two opposition parties, the MDC Mutumbara and the MDC Tsvangirai, and then ZANU itself. So on the paper, it looks like a classic power-sharing government. And certain elements have improved. As we know, education has improved, some of the inflation issues are dramatically improved, and some state workers are being paid. But what happened, and I think most people will testify to this fact, is that the MDC, the opposition, never was given real agency over the state security forces, over the military, over the police, or the actual running of the significant parts of the government. And now we're heading into another looming election crisis of next year, when the replication of 2008 and its violence seems to be on the cards again. So in 10 seconds, or 20 seconds, I just close by these shifting ethnic alliances, which I think are interesting because this speaks to the question, and it actually speaks to the Leipart-Horowitz debate about, are ethnic identities frozen and rigid, and you must use them and replicate them as blocks of power, or do they shift and react to different pressures and incentives within the state and within politics and society? And I think Zimbabwe is increasingly a case that is not Hutu and Tutsi. It's not black and white. It's not Zulu and Xhosa. It is a shifting group of identities that is no longer so based on ethnic identity. Before 1980, this was clearly a Shona versus Ndebele versus white state in many of the paramilitary and state actors. Then it sort of became, after 1980, Shona versus Ndebele, with the whites being somewhat neutral, sitting outside of the fray. And then it became the Shona and the Ndebele against the whites. There was a point where there was massive sort of black majority consensus about white behavior after independence. But that morphed into a position now where I think it's quite fascinating that Mugabe is left with a rump popular support, which is rural Shona, and only elements of that. But against him is this opposition movement that is Ndebele, that is white Zimbabwean, and is urban Shona. The cities of Mashonaland vote against Mugabe, and the loyalty of those leaders amongst the MDC, regardless of skin color, is perhaps one of the potentially hopeful aspects of the new Zimbabwe. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for being the first person ever to find a silver lining in Zimbabwe. We'll have two discussants on this panel, as for the others. Our first discussant is Gordon Crawford, on my left, who is Professor of Development Politics at the School of Politics and International Studies at the University of Leeds in the UK, where he is also the Director of the Center for Global Development. In addition, he is a co-editor of the journal called Democratization, and he was telling me last night about the extraordinary work that's required for that, and it is as my students know, providing collective goods and public goods is irrational. But editing a journal is one of the heights of providing a collective and public good. But thank you. Yes, thank you. Much of his recent work has focused on Ghana, and he has co-edited a special issue of the journal Democratization on, quote, democratization in Africa, challenges and prospects. And he's currently working on a research project entitled Human Rights, Power, and Civic Action in collaboration with the Norwegian Center for Human Rights at the University of Oslo. So, Gordon Crawford.
Thank you very much, Alan, and thank you for the invitation to be here. It's great to visit Austin for the first time. Lara and myself have decided on a slight division of labour between the two discussants, and that I will provide comments mainly on the three papers individually, and Lara will make more general points and bringing the three together. So the three cases all highlight shocks to the political system and to society generally that can arise from elections in particular, at times leading to violence. Sometimes that violence can take on an ethnic dimension. And this outcome was most clearly seen in the violence that followed the disputed elections in Kenya in 2007, with the violence crossing over into 2008, as Gilbert has outlined. I mean, interestingly, Ghana has also been included in this group of three studies as a comparative case where electoral violence has largely been avoided, presumably with the intent to see what lessons can be learned from the Ghanaian case. But I also think that these three cases, that they highlight the complexities of the interrelationships between political shocks, violent conflict, and constitutional design. And my remarks here sort of follow those to some extent made by Kathy Boone earlier. And these remarks arise from the framing of the CDCM project, sort of focusing on constitutional design as a mediating factor that may mitigate the risks of shock-related conflict. But in different ways, the cases here, especially Kenya and Zimbabwe, they emphasize the complexities and how constitutional design itself can be highly politicized and manipulated by state actors, in particular with resultant violence. So as I recall Kathy put it, government is not a disinterested third party. It is itself heavily implicated in the problems, or certainly can be. And taking the context of Kenya, here, as Gilbert has outlined, the shocks occurred from the early 1990s onwards. Those shocks were intricately bound up with, first, weaknesses in the constitutional design itself, second, pressures from both internal and external actors on the Kenyan government to undertake constitutional reforms, and perhaps most importantly, thirdly, the response of the Kenyan government to instigate violence after being forced to undertake a measure of constitutional reform. And this is evident in Gilbert's paper from the early 1990s onwards, notably with the manipulation and the incitement of so-called ethnic violence by Moi's government around the elections of 1992 and 1997. Gilbert seems to remain quite optimistic, or perhaps I felt in the paper he did, perhaps in his presentation slightly less so, but it seemed to me in the paper to remain quite optimistic that finally the shock of the terrible post-electoral violence in 07-08 was sufficient to force the political elite to introduce a fundamentally new constitutional design, one that may address the structural weaknesses that underpinned previous shocks. I hope he's right, but I think that perhaps in the final version of his paper, we will need more analysis of the power sharing agreement that brought in the current coalition government, and also more analysis of the implementation of the new 2010 constitution. So I think that the questions that Gilbert put on the table to us today, is this the end of the cycle or not? Is the new constitution sturdy enough to deal with future shocks? These are very key questions, but unfortunately, as perhaps on the basis of some guidance that he gets from you today, he'll have to answer them. I'm going to turn to Zimbabwe next. I enjoyed Andy's paper very much. Again, the complexities are emphasized of the interrelationships between shocks, conflict, and constitutional design. And I think these are, to me, were very much highlighted in the paper when Andy stated that, and I quote from the paper, Zimbabwe is unusual in that the majority of the crises visited upon the nation have not been spurred by natural disasters, global economic downturns, or foreign interventions. Rather, they have been catastrophes caused by the state itself. So again, government is implicated in the problems, indeed being held responsible for their very creation. So again, we have a very different scenario from constitutional design simply being seen as a mediating factor to mitigate conflict. Rather, we have a scenario where, one, the shocks arise out of the Zimbabwean state's intent to repress the opposition and to eliminate dissent. Two, the violence is perpetrated by the Zimbabwean state itself. And three, the state uses constitutional design to its own advantage. For example, the taming of the judiciary and again, as seen with the recent power sharing agreement. So this makes for a very interesting case study. It's one I think this is important, again, for the project as a whole, in highlighting how constitutional design is not a neutral or technical exercise, but a highly political one that can be exploited by incumbents. The bulk of the paper, as we've seen from the presentation, focuses on the three shocks to the political system and the violent responses of the Zimbabwean state. The coverage of these is very full and comprehensive, but I just have sort of three comments to put on the table. First is that in the conclusion, I would suggest that the wider implications of the Zimbabwean study for the project could be drawn out and elaborated on more. Secondly, my comment here, Andy, was going to be that your suggestion that about the title of the paper and Zimbabwe is a truly non-racial nation. I was going to say, perhaps in slightly different words, that it was rather provocative and overselling it, but you've said it yourself, so perhaps no reason to repeat that. But I suppose what I would say is that I'm not entirely convinced that Zimbabwe has become a truly non-racial nation. Perhaps you're not either. But one thing that the the paper doesn't emphasize is the splits in the MDC. You did mention them at the end, but I think that the splits in the MDC generally, as a sort of a very wide umbrella organisation, and particularly the splits into the two main factions, these should be highlighted more and perhaps indicate some of the limits to the notion of the non-racial Zimbabwe. And then similarly, I think that the parallels drawn between the white Rhodesian government of the 60s and the 70s and Mugabe's current regime is interesting but controversial. And I would suggest that such assertions at least need a bit more evidence to support this notion than given at present. Let me turn finally to Justin's paper on Ghana. I should have said at the beginning that all these are very detailed and fascinating papers, and Ghana is an interesting counter to the Kenya and Zimbabwe cases. As Justin outlined, sort of democratic transition and consolidation in Ghana have been relatively successful since the new constitution in 1992. 5 sets of increasingly successful parliamentary and presidential elections have been held with 2 peaceful transfers of power without recourse to violence. So what lessons can be learned? Well, this particular paper applies the framework of the research project more directly, both in terms of the selection of cases, so taking on the 3 criteria in terms of shocks, which are directly climate change related, indirectly climate change related, and unrelated to climate change, tries to select cases from each of those 3 categories. It also applies the framework of the project more directly in terms of the examination of constitutional design as a mediating factor between shocks and violence. In the spirit of constructive criticism, I would just like to make sort of 4 comments about ways in which I think the paper could be strengthened. As Justin has outlined, he examines 6 shocks from independence onwards. I'm not so convinced by the importance and the relevance of some of the older cases, the Volta Dam and the civil service case in particular. On the other hand, I think that the last shock, number 6, the December 2008 elections, is highly relevant and should get more attention. I mean, these elections were quite remarkable. They were incredibly close. If you look at the figures, and particularly the second round of the presidential election, there are 2 main political parties in Ghana which virtually monopolize all the parliamentary seats, and the 2 presidential candidates were neck and neck. But remarkably, violence was avoided, and there was a peaceful transfer of power. I think we need more detailed analysis of why and how this was achieved. If Ghana's success at avoiding electoral violence is partly due to its constitutional design, as understood in a broad sense, then we need to take lessons from this, and I don't think we should be hesitant to do so. I mean, Justin, you seemed a little hesitant in your paper about sort of policy transfer, but I think we need to learn any lessons that are there. But in relation to these December 2008 elections, I also think that we need to recognize that Ghana was on a knife edge during the days of the elections, and particularly the second round of the presidential elections. Ultimately, there was a peaceful transfer of power, thankfully so, but the situation in the country at that time was incredibly tense and could easily have gone the other way. I'm not saying this to detract from the peaceful outcome, but to emphasize the various factors that ultimately enabled peace to prevail. And I don't think this is due to luck. I think it's a mixture of structural factors associated with constitutional design, and also of contingency factors such as President Kufuor's intervention to accept the result, as is mentioned in the paper. And this, so sorry, lose my flow for a minute. So a second point, I'd suggest more focus on the current constitutional review commission. It is there in the paper, but if Ghana is a relatively successful case where constitutional design has mediated in a positive way to prevent conflict, then more consideration of the constitutional reforms being considered would be appropriate. Thirdly, I think that there could be more detail on the extent to which the two main parties do have an ethno-regional base or not, on whether this could be the source of future conflict, particularly around elections. It's a difficult issue. It's one where its very emphasis runs the danger of becoming self-fulfilling, so it needs careful treatment, but I don't think it can be ignored in a study of this nature. And then finally, I'm a little surprised that Ghana's history of military coups and military rule is not examined in more detail. And I noticed in your political trajectory on your slide, Justin, that sort of military regimes for much of the period between 66 to 91 were not mentioned. I think that they have to be there. You explain and justify your non-selection of military coups as your non-selection of them as shocks, because you say it's not possible to search for the mediating role of constitutional design when the Constitution has been abrogated. But I do think that what you do need to take into account is the extent to which the current 92 Constitution was written in order to prevent military coups being repeated. You talk about it as a compromise, but also the political opposition, the civil society actors, and also members of the PNDC, I think, were ready for a change. They weren't sort of dyed-in-the-wool autocrats, or not all of them. And also, I think that the 92 Constitution, its emphasis on civil and political rights, this has really enabled many civil society groups to take advantage of this, to flourish. The culture of silence that existed in Ghana during the military periods has now well and truly gone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And we now turn to our second discussant and final panelist on this panel. Laura Smith is assistant professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. And Laura came to my attention because of a 2009 article that she had written entitled "Explaining Violence After Recent Elections in Ethiopia and Kenya." So this is, and this was also in the journal Democratization. So it's a question that she herself has been asking and that we're asking on this panel. I would just point out that in addition to her academic work, she has also worked for USAID and for Oxfam America, and as an election observer in several countries in Africa. So without further ado, Laura Smith.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alan, for having me, and certainly to my fellow panelists for incredibly interesting and thought-provoking papers, and really to all the panelists. It's been a really rich discussion, and reminds me of why I love comparative politics so much, because you get that incredible richness in particular countries and people and places and histories that is just sort of eternally fascinating, and then you're challenged to try to think across those cases and draw out some patterns and some similarities, and most of all some lessons learned, and certainly you know, that is the purpose of the project. It's funny that you cite that article, because even with this panel, I often feel, as someone who's quite skeptical of sort of procedural notions of democracy, I keep getting pulled back into elections, which is funny. And yet, for I think precisely the reasons that have already been raised by earlier panelists, and that I think Andrew put so eloquently, so my tired efforts in my introduction to say something about people, I'll just refer to his comments and leave it. But I do think, I mean, there is a debate out there, right, if elections produce violence because the stakes are so low, or because the stakes are so high. And I think clearly the impetus behind this panel, and certainly the perspective that I take, is that even when citizens are sort of, at various points may withdraw from elections, or the process itself, or may fear them, the stakes are very high in that sense, and sort of the broader issue of constitutional design reflects that. And so it is an opportunity to sort of remind ourselves of that. So, as Gordon said, I'll just suggest some broad thematic connections between the three papers in the conclusion to this panel, and try to go through that as succinctly as I can. And then, we can take comments and questions and talk about more points. I have really just a few themes on that, and the first is to throw out there something that I have no answer for, but that just kept coming back as I read these papers, and emerged in the discussion before lunch, in conversations about governance versus accommodation, references to corruption, corrupt politicians. I've already forgotten what Gilbert referred to Moy as, but those sorts of comments, what I called individual leadership, and there it is. It's hard to account for in a conversation on constitutional design and conflict management, and in some ways I think it is the boogeyman to what we do, and yet in each paper there was some evidence of that, and so it is something that I at least want to put out there on the table for us to continue to consider, because it is the luck, good luck or bad luck, that has been bandied about. So, for example, in Justin's paper, when talking about the Volta Dam project, for example, he says, quote, Krumah associated himself closely with the project and took personal responsibility for it. I've been looking at big dam projects in Ethiopia lately, and how they're proceeding and are planned to proceed, and thinking about that in light of a much older project, as Gordon points out, and the sort of personal role that a leader takes in that, and the impact that has on success or not. And all of the cases really pointed that up. So similarly, Gilbert points out a number of places where individual leadership decisions played a role. So, for example, in 1997 in Kenya, in the context of attempts at constitutional reforms and mass action and violence, Moy was, quote, persuaded by moderates within his party to allow for reforms. And then Gilbert quotes another scholar, Mutua, as saying that Moy was an astute political animal who knew that the political crisis over reforms could not be wished away. In fact, it could cost him political power. And so he sort of made a reset in that moment on the individual level. And then certainly we come to Zimbabwe in the case of political leadership. Certainly there, as Andrew points out, we see really the most aggressive and really ugly face of personal leadership. But also in that sense, right, he points out, I think, very well, tries to connect that personal leadership with institutional arrangements. And so, for example, in the case that he spoke of in his presentation, and I won't say much about, when Mugabe faced this loss in the referendum and decided to basically send out the dogs in the form of the War Vets Association to occupy these farms, there were institutional arrangements that could have mitigated some of that violence, and he points out some of those. So things like an independent electoral commission that we do see in Ghana, or changes in electoral systems as well. And then he says, and it was such a poignant quote that I'll share it here, that the violence of this time was, quote, more about the political life and death of Robert Gabriel Mugabe. And that's certainly a point of what he says. So it's a difficult thing to account for here, but I do think it's important to remember that aspect sort of swirls around the personal psychology, but also the personal acumen of some of the leaders. I think the ambassador's keynote speech at lunch was such a vivid demonstration of some of those aspects in that term. The second point is much more central to what we're here to do, and one that, of course, when you're nearly the last discussant, and I'm not the last discussant today, but close, you think, oh, I'm going to say, I won't have anything to say. So I'm sort of surprised that this hasn't come up in greater conversation, so I'm glad in a sense that I thought to put it on. But it is this power of the executive, and it certainly comes up in all three of the cases that arise around shocking elections in this case. So, for example, Justin notes that in many ways the revisions and new constitutions at certain points and even current conversations are about the goal of reducing the power of the presidency. He talks quite a bit about what kinds of a checks and balances system could be introduced, other kinds of institutions that might countervail the power of the presidency, and gives, I think, some really vivid examples of what the powers of the president are, like the power to appoint all local level mayors and a third of all local government, if I got that correct. So, evidences of those kinds of institutional opportunities for intervention, I think, appear really throughout the three cases. Certainly, Kenya is in many ways the quintessential example of that as well, the imperial presidency model, as it's often called in Kenya. In that sense, we see a great opportunity, and I really agree that the opportunity to include the Ghanaian example with the other two examples really provided a richness to thinking about elections and institutions. So in the case of Ghana, to see what role the courts have been able to play, however powerful the president is, it really stands in stark contrast to places like Kenya, where, if I'm correct, your paper, I don't think cites, people don't go to the courts, right? You just wouldn't, it's sort of a joke, right? Why would you go to the courts? And certainly as well in the Zimbabwe case, we see a couple of instances, important instances, where the court blocks some of Mugabe's actions, and then Mugabe sends out, the police do not enforce high court rulings that say that these occupations are illegal, for example. So the really interesting tension between a couple of types of institutions is played out here. Maybe this is about the relevant importance of the courts, but I really saw it as very much about what kinds of interventions might be made around the tremendous power of the executive in these types of cases. That, of course, gets us back to the much more difficult question of the how, and I'm not sure that any of the papers, unless I missed it, perhaps they could clarify for me, had ideas about that, although they all certainly pointed out this interesting combination of sort of personal ability and interest in individual leaders and a powerful institution in the form of the president. But I do think I had sort of seen this as a point to talk about institutional flexibility and the long term, and I think that also really came out in Ambassador Golti's discussion at lunchtime about constitutional design being really such a long-term process that one can't think. So in that sense, it's a perfect place for us to say that on a panel on elections, right, which are generally sort of understood in a really time-bound and often very short-term. That's the critique of them, right, from the donor perspective, from parties and even from voters, that they're sort of understood as a day, and so there's some lead up and some tiny accounting for the follow-up, and that's it. But in fact, it may be many election cycles. I think that's clearly was the message of the comparative constitutional conversation in the morning, of how long does it take for our constitution to mature, with or without amendments, but also in this point of really reforming the idea of what a president is in the African context, and that may clearly take some amount of time. Got it. So three additional points, and I'll be super quick. So coming back to this endogeneity question that I can't resolve methodologically, I was struck over and over where political violence is not just an outcome, but a cause. And that also seemed to me something, perhaps you've talked about this in earlier meetings, but I wanted to raise it for our conversation as well. I think Gilbert makes this point most eloquently in using the Kenya case to talk about a cycle of violence and reform, that however incremental does eventually get to an exciting opportunity in the 2010 Constitution, however, it turns out. But that question of what the role of political violence is, or clearly its absence, right? And that's why thinking about the absence of violence, even if it's an N of one, maybe it means then that these other institutions like the courts can do their work better, right? And so, that relationship seems to me important. It's interesting, and I totally defer to Gordon on this because clearly he's the Ghana expert, and of all the three cases, it's the one I knew the least about. But I had really appreciated the Volta Dam example. But because I had hoped that, and was somewhat struck throughout the day, that in the discussion of broadly considered climate change, environmental factors, developmental interventions were not considered. And to me, the Volta Dam, and clearly you can see where I'm going. I mean, like I said, I've been immersed in commercial farm sales and dam projects in Ethiopia. So I'm thinking about this, so naturally I was excited about a 1950s dam in Ghana. But this broad impact of a shock of a development plan like a dam, which is both about harnessing the natural environment, the discussion of flooding in Senegal earlier today is instructive to that, right? But when a regime attempts to do the opposite of what appears to have been done in Senegal, but to try to create a developmental intervention with a different climactic and environmental and economic outcome, that in and of itself could be a very powerful, and in fact has been a very powerful shock with significant impacts. So that's something that, that I hope where it's relevant in either these papers or other papers of the project could be discussed. And it certainly relates as well to things like the simmering land reform that Gilbert mentioned as well, right? So that would be another example, I think, if land reform goes forward, of a kind of state-led developmental intervention that in and of itself will undoubtedly be a shock or a series of shocks, no matter how well it's done or not well in that sense. So my final point, because I'm sure I'm sort of at the end, is precisely this sort of broad question of what I've called institutional flexibility, right? Something I think you see in the Ghana case so well, and you almost see the opposite of in Kenya, although I'd have to think about that a bit more, which is, Kenyans have struggled for many, many decades to get any kind of constitutional change, right? The Constitution sort of has existed as a solidified mass that couldn't be changed. It was either all or nothing, right? And one account of the last couple of decades, at least in Kenya, is that lack of flexibility led to a kind of ramping up of violence culminating in 2007. It's just one hypothesis, as opposed to a place like Ghana that does get more incremental kinds of constitutional and institutional revisions, and maybe that's able to relieve certain kinds of tension that at least contributes to the relative absence of political violence in Ghana. And so clearly that question of the flexibility of institutions in all of this, and I mean, I actually had ended with the March 2000 Supreme Court case in Zimbabwe, where the court ruled in favor of the farmers, demanding that the occupiers had to leave, and then again in November of 2000, as Andrew points out, when white farmers won this ruling. I mean, on the one hand, the institution fails because the police don't enforce it, right? And Mugabe is still there. But on the other hand, the court remains as an institution that's asserting its authority, its right to interpret the law. And so that, may speak to sort of the longer term argument or not. So I wonder if there'll be a future role for the court in future constitution making and revisions in Zimbabwe in all of that sense. And so finally, back to, I think, the question as it was posed earlier, what do institutions do? In some sense, they give people a focus, a forum. Gotcha, it's my last sentence. A sort of symbol to hold on to in that sense. In that sense, elections as a symbol, courts perhaps as a symbol, constitutions that need to be reformed and don't over decades as a symbol that people can work towards, and they certainly may withdraw or or engage further in that reform. But without that, it's hard to imagine sort of how they would reform some of the larger political issues that really matter to them. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Well, this has been a long panel, but you've been very patient, so I'd like to open up the floor for questions. We have probably about 5 or 10 minutes. How about ambassadors always get first go. Could we get a microphone over for Greg Engel? This is Ambassador Greg Engel.
Thank you all for your wonderful presentations and analysis. It's really gratifying as one who helped a little bit to steer this CCAPS ship as we got started, to see the extent to which you've come. The purpose of this project, in some respects, beyond the actual research, was threefold: to advance scholarship research, to develop the next generation of scholars and policymakers in this area, which are a lot of the people sitting here today, and to advise policymakers. And so this is a very important part of the project, the constitutional question design. It's foundational. But after many years, 10 years, I guess, of living in 4 African countries as a policymaker or implementer, as I think about what you're saying, and I think about the elections I've gone through, the constitutional processes, the one in Malawi was like gladiators of foreign experts, I have a couple of thoughts. And one is that it's good to see so many amazing experts, people in their fields who study this stuff and care about it. I would sure like to see a lot more Africans involved in this as time goes on, because there are plenty of them who know this stuff very well, and we're talking about their continent. And then as I step back and I think about my time in Africa, if someone said, well, what was your greatest concern? And I'm dealing directly with governments. In a couple of cases, it was constitutions. Malawi definitely had to change its single-party constitution to move on. Good constitutional design augurs well for a good future, but it's no guarantee of a good future. And in Togo, a similar problem with their constitution. But the real problem, stepping back, is that a lot of, and it gets exactly to the point that you made, Dr. Smith, it's leadership. A lot of these governments, good constitution or bad, simply aren't governing in ways that we would consider government. They're not delivering service to their people. I've lived in too many African countries where I might go to the presidency, and in the anteroom, the entire cabinet would be there simply waiting in case the president wanted to see them. And what would be going on at their ministries? Nothing. Because no one at their ministry was going to make a decision without the minister. The minister wasn't going to make a decision without the president. Was it extra constitutional? Or was it contrary to the Constitution? No, none of that was. It was all, not necessarily contemplated within the Constitution. It was not extra constitutional, but it's bad governing practice. And so I think that as you move on and you consider these things, and I know there is another project that looks at institutional capacity, that always has to be taken into account, that the best designed constitutions can go absolutely nowhere. Do you want to know what the best designed constitutions look like? Absolutely. But that's a far cry from getting to good implementation and good governance.
Great, thank you very much. Other questions? One in the back there? Can you identify yourself?
So, my name is Aaron. Thank you all. Given the, if developed countries are kind of take it as the model for development, given the current economic situations, which are resulting in prime minister changes and changes in governmental dismissals, what do African countries or other less developed countries what changes in constitutional design could be made,
Right.
given current direction? And would the gentleman from Italy kind of begin?
Justin Frosini?
If possible, since current, and then also from
So is your question, what lessons can Africa learn from the industrialized world in
From what-
terms of constitutional design?
from what's currently going on?
And also is implicit sort of you're saying we need to get our own house in order since things don't seem to be working so well here? Okay, maybe that was my inference. All right, let's put the question to the panel because it actually I would just say one or two things. One is someone was, I think it was Pierre earlier, was talking about this oxymoron of hyper-centralized federalism. And I thought, haha, those African states. And I thought, wait, maybe I live in a hyper-centralized federal. I'm pretty sure I do. So, all right, let's turn it over to the panel for any comments on that. Are there lessons to learn? Oh, the other thing I was just going to say is it's a little ironic for Philippe Rentgens to be giving recommendations about constitutional design for Africa, in a sense, because he's Belgian. And one cannot think of a more screwed up constitutional design at the moment. So it's, there is a certain irony. I'll turn it,
I think there's a great relevancy
Andrew?
for that.
No, so I agree with you in the sense, I agree with sort of the implication of your question. And my gut feeling has always been that political institutions are obviously not perfect science by any means, and they only have a constrained effect. But even more than that, they're very much tailored to the specific needs of the nation state, its history, its demography, its political pressures. What you design, the way you cut the cloth to suit Ghana or Senegal or Mozambique is very different to how you would design those institutions appropriately for Fiji or Papua New Guinea or Guatemala, wherever else. But not just that. I think it's not just Africa versus Europe. I think within Africa, there are very individualized pressures for each state. So it's very hard to transport lessons. In fact, Professor Groffman and I were talking last night, and we've sort of come to the conclusion that after years of studying this, you can get constitutions very wrong, and you can get political institutions designed in such a way that they're clearly going to be problematic. And we know about that. But actually getting them right or designing them in such a way we know will be good is a much more difficult objective and a discipline to do. So we know what sort of doesn't work, but it's harder to know what does work. And that will be true. You know, look, my own country, the United Kingdom, has gone through a series of very recent iterations of constitutional redesign, massive redesign of autonomy to warring ethnic tribes throughout the country. We have 7 different election systems going on at the same time. New Zealand is going through a massive referendum right now about changing its election system. Ireland is going through constitutional redesign, let alone Italy and Belgium and all these other cases. But what I think the principle is that, A, it takes a long time for constitutions and institutions to take root and become routinized and regularized in the population, as Professor Ginsberg and others were talking about. And secondly, it's all about inclusion when the pressure and the fault line is such that getting it wrong leads to war and violence. You know, getting it wrong in Belgium is frankly not leading to war right now. Getting it wrong in Central Eastern Europe can have those problems in Western Europe. But in Africa, getting it wrong in Nigeria, getting it wrong in Congo, getting it wrong in Zimbabwe, Kenya, leads to massive loss of life and the destabilization of the state. And so it's all about inclusion and reassuring majorities and minorities. And so I think those principles can be transported across from the histories of design in Europe all the way back to the 18th, 19th century. You know, Switzerland was a basket case, Belgium was a basket case, the Netherlands was a basket case, and they had to redesign their institutions to balance majorities and minorities, to reassure groups that they had a role. And I think the principle in Nigeria or Kenya or any other state is similar today. It's reassuring people they're protected within the nation state.
Justin, did you want to add a few words?
Yeah, and I wanted to connect this question to one of Gordon's comments about was I hesitant with respect to the Ghanaian model? I have to say, I want to be very clear on this point. To be honest, it's not hesitance. It's a dislike, frankly, for the idea of legal transplanting. Because if we take the example of Ghana, and, for example, reference to Ellie's research, we are -2, and we're an integrative model. It is a presidential system, majoritarian system. It has worked in Ghana, although there were tensions in 2008, and the role of Kufur in finally saying, yes, they've won, was probably fundamental. And therefore, as a constitutionalist, I'm a bit hesitant in saying, can we take that form of government and transplant it elsewhere? If we have a blood group, and here I'm taking from medical constitutionalism or constitutional medicine of Andrew, we may have a refusal of that transplant. And I think it can be quite dangerous. And the other example, incredible as it might seem, is actually the Electoral Commission, which is considered a model in the context of West Africa and beyond. And yet the members of the Electoral Commission are appointed by the president. Now, it's worked in the Ghanaian context because of the authority exerted also by the chair of that Electoral Commission. My wonder is if we were to take that Electoral Commission and, again, transplant it elsewhere, would it work in the same way? So Ghana is certainly an interesting case, but I am, as a constitutionalist, disinclined to start saying, let's take the Ghanaian model and start exporting it or transplanting it elsewhere.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm going to call this panel to a